So our announcements for today are as follows. We have some courses coming up. So for those of you that have not yet done Enneagram training, we have Enneagram training 3 full days that are appropriate for the South Africa, Africa, Europe time zone. And if you're in parts of Asia, it works for you as well. July 2021-22. And then for those of you in both in the Europe, Africa, as well as the North South America time zones, we have a course coming up in October. So please look at that. It's that course is shorter sessions, more shorter sessions, whereas the July one is longer. Then maturity, adult development, and the Enneagram training, our level 2 course, we have a couple of spaces still left for the August training. It's going to be a wonderful group. And then facilitating and teaching the Enneagram, a course in September. For those of you that have done level 1, 2, and 3, if you want to finish the full IEA certificate that we offer as being an Enneagram school for the IEA, level 4 is probably the one that you still need to finish. So please let us know if you want to register for any of these courses. Our website around accreditations has a form to sign up. And then secondly, we are very excited to show you, you will see on the right side a visual, and this is of our new upgraded look and feel for our reports. And we're busy implementing at the moment. The team report is already live. So new upgraded look and feel of our team reports. If you like what you see here and you want to look at more of our team reports and get some samples, please let us know. But know that we have significantly made our things more beautiful, and we're very excited about that. So as we get started today, maybe people can just type in the chat box where in the world you are, so we get a sense of who is here on the call today. And then I'll get us into our topics. And as usual, we're going to have a breakout fairly soon so that people can start connecting to the topic, and then we'll work with some of the theory in the large group after that. So yes, I see that people are chatting and checking in terms of where they are. Welcome from all the parts of the world. So this is the book that I've been spending some time with and turning into some content for our training as well. It's a book from 2019. It's called Upgrade, Building Your Capacity for Complexity by Boston and Ellis. And this is probably the most conventional of the adult development books that I have come across. It's kind of written at a performing level of maturity, very accessible for leaders, very practical in its ideas. And the core premise of this book is that if you want to do vertical development for yourself, and so it's written as a kind of how-to guide, but there's also lots of really interesting thoughts and ideas on how coaches can support people to upgrade. And it's nice, accessible language as well. They really break the adult development theory process, the upgrading process, into 4 capacities: sense-making, perspective shifting, self-relating, and opposable thinking. Now, when I was reading the book, I would say that opposable thinking is interesting. It's probably, in my language, the language that I would use is polarity thinking. It's really about 80% of what's meant with this. And what I'm going to do is you have your own relationship with these words: sense-making, perspective shifting, self-relating, and opposable thinking. So I am going to break us into 4 breakout groups. Each of the groups will get one of these topics to work with. And what I'm going to ask you to do in your breakout room, and you will have 20 minutes for this exercise, is first, whatever capacity you get assigned to, how would you define this capacity? So if you are in the sense-making group, you're only going to work with sense-making. If you're in the perspective shifting group, you'll only work with that one. So question 1, how would you define this capacity? Not knowing how the book defines it. That's exactly the purpose here. We'll get multiple perspectives in. Second thing is, now that you've defined as a group this capacity, each of you do a self-rating on this. And you can use, they use a 4-level scale. You know, you don't necessarily know what the 4 levels mean at this point. So what you can do is just give yourself a score on a scale of 1 to 10, discuss that in the group. Why are you scoring yourself there? What do you think are your superpowers in terms of this capability or capacity? What can you still develop? And then to think about, now, if I, as a coach, in my one-on-one work with my clients, or if you work predominantly with teams and groups, you can go into that space as well. If I had to support a group to develop their capacity in this thing that I'm in the group for, how might we go about it? So let's do kind of grounded theory here. So I'm just giving you headings. You're going to build your own theory around this. And how do you define it? Talk about how you'd rate yourself. What are you great at? What might be developmental for you there? And how would you go about developing this? So as this is on the screen, if you want to take a screenshot of that, you can. And let me pop people into breakout rooms. And I'm just going to rename the room. So please note what room you're being invited to. I'll also just read it out for people so that people know which room they're in. Let's do this one as well. So if you are in the room, if you end up in the room with Andrea and Charlotte and Duncan, you will be in the Sensemaking room. If you are in a room with Micah, Paula, Praveen, Rikus, Opposable thinking, keeping in mind that another word for that might be polarity thinking, is what you're going to be working on. If you're in a room with Chantal, Ilse, Jen, you're in the perspective shifting room. And if you're with Alistair, Johan, Pat, you are in the self-relating room. I might, if people come late, pop other people into the room, so be open to having visitors. There we go. See you back here in 20 minutes. And introduce yourselves in the room if you don't know each other.
So self-knowing self and understanding self, and there we went a bit deeper there, looking at maybe what shaped us, where we are today, understanding what kind of values and beliefs have shaped us to where we are today. Our emotional field, how does that, what is triggered in our emotional field? How do we think? Not what do we think, but how do we think? All these are part of self-knowing, but it's not enough to understand self. There's also something that is around self-managing or self-regulating. So not for that. Was the discussion that we had. All these elements came for us to the central theme of self-relating. And we were not able to talk about how to coach. I have some thoughts on that, but we didn't discuss it in our group.
Okay, great. So let's start from there. And part of the reason that we're starting from there is just because I think for many of the people here in the room, the Enneagram is part of our frame of reference. And for me, when I was looking at self-relating, I'm like, oh, okay, so this is how the Enneagram directly supports adult development and maturation and our upgrading. So the way in which Boston and Ellis define self-relating. So first, for each of these, they have a definition, but then they also have a kind of a cool question that you can take to your coaching clients. And they say self-relating is observing, understanding, and regulating and transforming yourself. So making sense of your own reactions, thoughts, and feelings. So very much in the space that Pat and the rest of the group were in. The nice question that they work with is, how could I best show up here? Yeah. How can I best show up here? So as our clients bring certain contextual challenges to us, keeping at this question, how can I best show up here? How am I showing up? How can I best show up here is really important. Now, they credit both Keegan and Garvey Berger's work as being really important in our self-relating capability. So for those of you that are aware of Jennifer's work on mind traps, etc., this would feed the self-relating space quite directly. Now, what they then do in the book is they have the 4 levels. And in terms of the levels, read it from the bottom to the top, right? So level 1 is like entry level. Level 4 is like higher grade. And they say everything starts from noticing. So if I can't observe myself, if I can't notice my patterns, if I'm not aware of them, then there's not much I can do from there. So the first is the noticing piece. And I think in our coaching practice, this is where what happens in the coaching itself, rather than just the report of what happens outside of the coaching space, becomes so important. So if the client is showing up and every time we go in direction A, they become defensive, obviously I can work with it and I can help them notice that that is what's happening for them in the moment. So that's level 1, just work on noticing. The second level they call balancing. And in each of these levels, they have a what leaves when I'm in this level and I'm doing work at this level and what comes in. So they call it the goodbye and the hello. So the goodbye at the balancing level is really when I only after the fact notice that I have acted and shown up in a way that I didn't want to show up in. So I'm not catching myself in the moment, I'm catching myself after the fact. Now, as I continue to do work at the second level, I catch myself sooner and sooner and sooner and sooner. And then, of course, if I can start catching myself in the moment, now I'm starting to be in a really good zone. They actually do not reference the, the conscious leadership schools work on above the line, below the line. But I find that really, really interesting in this space. So if we work with our clients of that idea of, am I above the line? So I'm open, curious, creative, or below the line, I've become closed, etc., more defensive, then that's useful. So I would bring in, if I'm working beyond noticing what I'm doing, above the line, below the line, and catching myself more and more in the moment is what I'm working on here. And then what they say is very important when I'm at level 2 of self-relating is to strike a balance between meeting others' expectations and living up to my own beliefs and values. So I'm really working on what's going on for me, what's going on for them. What do I need? What do they need? What do I need? What do they need? So if you're working as well then with something like NVC, nonviolent communications, that working emotions, needs, and even into requests, but especially emotions and needs is really useful here. Then at the third level, they start working with the idea of experimenting. And the big principle of this book is, in fact, and I'll summarize towards the end this again, but the big principle is much easier to act yourself into new ways of thinking than it is to think yourself into new ways of acting. So if we can experiment with certain behaviors, if we bring it into the action space, we can change our neural pathways around things. But just sitting in my chair and thinking about how I'm going to show up differently is not really going to cut it. So at the experimenting level, they say, part of what I need to say goodbye to is treating my identity as a single, stable, logically coherent thing. So I actually need to make peace with my multiple identities. I know Julia often speaks in this space around making my identity more complex and accepting that it's contradictory. So this idea of Lucille can be described as extroverted, feeling, I'm using MBTI language here for a moment quite deliberately, intuiting, perceiving, whatever it is, that this is my personality, out with that idea. I'm extroverted, I'm introverted, sometimes I'm in my head, sometimes I'm in my heart, sometimes I'm angry, sometimes I'm kind. It's not logically coherent. It is, in fact, something that has many facets to it. And if I can work on letting go of that idea that these are the 7 characteristics that describe me, then that's going to help me notice the parts of me that before I couldn't notice because I was too busy trying to fit into the box I'd created for myself. Now, from an Enneagram perspective, when I get really attached to my Enneagram style, that might become as much of a problem as a lot of other characteristics that I might be thinking of. So that idea of complexifying my identity and maybe losing my Enneagram style, as opposed to hanging on to it, I am only this, is very useful here. Then the hello piece in the experimenting side is becoming increasingly aware of my unhelpful patterns of thinking and feeling, and then able to shift those patterns over time. So there are a number of different patterns that we work with here, pattern recognition for the self, that there's some practical tools that they suggest we work with. And obviously, if you're sitting with a coaching client over multiple sessions in long-term coaching, you can also see those patterns because the patterns will play out, not just in how they bring issues to the coaching, but also in how they show up in the coaching. And then 4th level, which is really the, the black belt, so to speak, of self-relating, is when we disconnect our hot buttons, our triggers. And we don't get, so maybe we still have those triggers, but we're no longer getting hijacked by them. Oh, how interesting. This has just happened again. And look, I was calm. I could feel myself potentially getting worked up, but I didn't. There's some work there. As well as my limiting beliefs and unhelpful behavior patterns. And then hello is living in alignment with my principles, my purpose, my preferences, not just in an imaginary way, but in the way I show up. And so managing then when I can't show up in line with my principles or purpose, managing the tension and genuinely reinventing myself to be contextually appropriate. So in Enneagram language, we might speak about spending more time in the center of the Enneagram. Yeah. So one more thing I want to share here, and then we're going to talk about self-relating. So think about what's coming up for you and your questions. Now, in the book itself, there are very practical sections around reflect on things and ask yourself these questions, and then go and investigate and go and ask people close to you these questions, and then go and experiment in this kind of way. And as you go from one stage to the next, it really broadens, complexifies what you're investigating, what you're reflecting on, etc. Now, some of the things that I found really helpful in what they spoke about in this space is definitely the practice of daily journaling, which I know a lot of people suggest and to clients, but really building discipline around journaling. And their suggestion is don't go and just ask your clients to journal in an open-fashioned way. When you start the coaching, maybe it's very simple journaling. So just note some moods that you experience during the day. Give them a question to work with between sessions, and then you can build up the complexity of what they need to be reflecting on. The second stage to build from the reflections is the inquiry piece. So if you're working with your clients, for example, on mood reflections, then go and ask 2 or 3 people that are really close to you, maybe someone at home, maybe someone at work, depending on what's contextually appropriate, how they've experienced you. Not just in general, but yesterday in that meeting, this is what I experienced. How did you experience me? So asking friends and colleagues for feedback on the things they've been journaling about. And then the next step from there is to go and do some experiments in some kind of way. Okay, I feel I'm going to, when I'm getting angry, this is maybe what I'm going to try to do differently. So you can define some experiments together. Now, from mood, they say, okay, first explore mood. Now I'm getting to know myself. Then I might explore a topic like my energy. How does my energy flux from one day to the next? Now, if a client has specific things around stress management or resilience or whatever it is, so you can use the coaching client's goals in terms of what they reflect on. They also say that a very interesting area of exploration is to look at what triggers me, and then what impact do I have on the system once triggered. So that's more at the experimenting level 3 and 4 in their language, where I'm really working with my triggers and my impact and what's the impact I want to have, and mapping that in some way. And then directly at the later level, so experimenting, self-determining, working with Robert Keegan's work on competing commitments. And just very briefly, for those of you that are not familiar with competing commitments, the idea there is to say, okay, what's the behavior I want to invite in my life? So let's say I want to become more self-caring because I neglect myself. Then the first step of this is define what self-care looks like, and then probably leave them to go and fail at self-care. Because in between what's happening now and my intention, there are some other competing commitments that's interfering with this new intention of mine. So then you come back with the client and say, okay, so why is this not working? What's getting in the way? And what you actually need to work on are the competing commitments and figuring out the relationship between my desire for self-care and my desire to, whatever it is, stay on top of my workload, as a simple way of looking at it. And so that's the real space where the work needs to happen, as opposed to just being in the end game. It's in the thing that interferes, the competing commitments there. So self-relating, I know we have lots of other very interesting things that we can do that comes from the Enneagram. The Enneagram can fast track self-relating and insights in many ways. But let's hear thoughts, questions, comments. What's come up for you as we're talking about self-relating as the first capability that we can develop? Happy to hear from all the groups, not just the group that was working with us.
Well, this is Libby, and I guess what I'm realizing, I don't know the model from the book Upgrade, but as you go through this one, it almost sounds like there's within each of their 4 categories, there's development, right? There's a sense of identity development within each definition, I guess, or category. If I'm following you.
Yeah, so they kind of talk about these as 4 capabilities that we can work on distinctly. So if we think about adult development, as a whole, we say that we're shifting from one stage to the next. And we know that certain life experiences, etc., especially at the conventional levels, can help us shift. Their core entry point is to say, sometimes it's really hard to figure out how to make a stage change. And so what if we give people 4 practical capabilities that if we work on these capabilities, we can support stage change quite deliberately and practically in the way in which we relate to ourselves. They kind of talk about developing almost a kind of fitness through some daily practices. So the idea with the book is daily practices that, if they're supported by coaching, of course, they work much better because I have an accountability partner. But many practices that I can work with day in and day out to build a fitness that helps me to upgrade my operating system in the way that we speak of in adult development theory. And they do work with these 4 as related but separate capabilities that we can work with ourselves or with our coaching clients. Does that make sense, Libby?
Yeah, actually, that's very helpful. Thanks. The 4 capabilities makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And I think more broadly, it's a lot more complex than just 4 capabilities. And when we're working with clients at, for example, a technician specializing level that say, okay, I want to upgrade, how do I do it? We need to find ways of actually breaking it down into something that is more workable than always going to very abstract ideas. So this is getting in the space of daily practices and rhythms. Yeah. Other thoughts on self-relating, and just this idea of, oh, this is where the Enneagram maybe fits into the adult development work. I know often we say adult development work describes integration in the Enneagram, but this is how what the Enneagram enables fits into adult development work is also for me a really cool bridge. Yeah.
Lucille,
Yes, Alistair.
So, you know, the other term for adult development is ego development. So the way I understand how the ego is formed is that society plays a part in the formation of that ego and how it develops. So linking it to self-relating, and this is something we discussed in our group, to say that self, you know, how much of that self is influenced by society. And so people will say, oh, I'm self-aware, right? And let's say you've got something that triggers you. Let's say this Roe versus Wade situation, right?
Yes.
And whichever side you are on the fence on that one, and you get triggered by that, how much of those triggers are influenced by society and not the true self, so to speak? And I think what you just said now about the journaling, what would be is very important. And I think what I would do if I had a client, I'd say, okay, you got triggered. Where does that thought come from? You know, is it you being triggered, or it's because, you know, what will the neighbors think if I go left or right? So that's what's coming up for me in today's topic.
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. I do think that a lot of, as we know, our sense of self and who we are and our patterns around this are not just shaped by our socialization, but shaped by the conversation between me and my context. Yeah, so absolutely agree with that. The thing that is interesting to just note is especially, so in the Enneagram world, we talk quite a lot about the essential self, the true self, you know, there's different words that are used for that. And just to note that that idea of the true self or the essential self is not universally accepted as a thing that actually exists. From an existential perspective, that idea that who I am is always becoming, but there's not this ideal self that's been tainted by the world that's out there to be reclaimed. I can only continue to become, but there's no thing that I've maybe lost. Now, psychodynamically, it would be very different. We say we're born in trust, and then we lose our trust and we lose our true selves, and we need to return to that. So maybe just to throw that spanner in the works in some way. But I agree that it's very useful, especially once people can start noticing myself and I'm relating to myself almost more intimately in that kind of way, more self-knowledge, more self-regulation, to start identifying my triggers, to go and journal about them. Core thing here is not just to make sense of where it comes from, but practically when I am being triggered by this thing happening in the world, how am I choosing to respond? Is it taking me below the line? Am I getting defensive, angry, upset, and now I can't do other things because I read this article about the topic in question? Or is there something else that I want to work with here? Yeah. Other thoughts, other inputs on this? Okay, so self-relating may be one of the areas that we know somewhat well. So I think the one thing that I just wanted to quickly pop on the screen as well, for those of you that are less familiar with Jennifer Garvey-Berger's work, which is also referenced, although in Upgrade they don't talk about it directly, they just say this is the inspiration for this. Jennifer's book on the different mind traps and thriving in complexity talks about 5 different mind traps that we can get stuck in. So the first mind trap is our need to be right. The second is our simple stories of how things work. The third is our need for agreement. The fourth is our need to be in control. And the fifth is the trap of our ego, which Alistair also referenced there. So in her work, she works with different ways as coaches that we can ask questions like, if we're working with rightness, identify places where you're really certain, a complex issue, where you're really certain that you've got the right end of the stick here. And then to work with, what do I believe and how might I be wrong? How could I be wrong here? And really working with our clients with these questions can be very powerful. When I'm coming up against a very simple story that a client has, what different stories could you tell about this? And I was working with a client earlier today who was saying, so I have this person who reports to me, and we used to be, before I got promoted, I was her mentor. She's a younger staff member, really bright star, things were going really well. I got promoted to head of department, and she's completely turned off. And she's not reaching out anymore. She's not mailing me. She's putting in lots of sick notes. And the story this leader had made up is that because I've been promoted, they have withdrawn from the relationship with me. And that's what's going on here. It's the hierarchy. And that's a very simple story for what might be going on here. We're talking about pandemic times, we're talking about, I mean, there's many stories you could make up here that could be different to that specific story. And so we started working with her around what other stories might be in play here. And then what if you just let go of the stories and went and had a conversation with her? Pat?
Yeah, Lucille, with that, I think Jennifer Berger's work is really, really wonderful to use in coaching space, but it is around this one specifically. I think it's around perspective shifting, not so much the 5 mind traps. There's a lot around perspective shifting, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think for me also, when I was looking at this, I was curious that this is where they put both Keegan and Garvey-Berger's work, because a lot of that has to do with it. I get some of the exercises they're given, but I'm not sure that it's exactly where it sits.
Yeah. And the first thing for me, self-relating, was Enneagram.
Yeah,
that's my first step in any coaching program. Is first the report, and then start talking about and noticing where.
And that's what came up for me as well. That's why I put Enneagram in brackets. And I was very curious in this book that they did not refer to any kind of methods for helping people see themselves in the mirror. I'm like, surely you've missed the trick here. We know some really great technologies for self-relating. I guess the point that is useful to take from this, though, is that sometimes something like the Enneagram can become a trap again. Because sometimes now I see new things about myself, but I also have new excuses for not necessarily shifting my behavior, or I'm limiting in some way the way in which I think about myself. So that idea of at the level 3, that if I start getting stuck in my descriptions of my Enneagram style, and that becomes some coherent narrative that keeps other information out about how multifaceted and complex I am, then that might not be so useful. But that's only later.
I was wondering if they do anything around the inner critic work around self-relating. Anything around that?
So they do speak about it a little bit. They don't go into it much. So one of the reflective questions they say you could ask your client is to say, you know, when this happens, what's the story you tell yourself?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but they don't double click on it. And I think that's a lovely connection. The inner critic work is a big part of self-relating that we can work with here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I'm going to just finish this stuff on Jennifer Garvey Berger. And then when we go to perspective shifting, you can see if you feel that it fits better in there as well. So on agreement, could this conflict serve to deepen a relationship? So just tell that story. And then in terms of the need for control, what can I enable? And what could enable me? In complexity, no one is in control. What's my need for control about? I guess the ego part here is very directly related to the self-relating, because it is to do with who am I going to be next, as opposed to getting stuck in a single identity for myself. Libby?
Yeah, Lucille, I'm curious if you could keep your story about your client as you walk through those stages. Like, you know, in other words, you were starting to say, is there another story that she could be telling herself? And just what happened? I don't know if that's interesting for anyone else to see what happened.
Yeah, well, so the context for this is just to say it was a group process. It was in a group training program that we were running this morning. So we don't quite know what's going to happen next. But the conversation we then had from having multiple stories is to say, so what do you want to do next? And she said, well, maybe I need to go and speak to her so that I can find out what the story is, as opposed to the story I've made up. Okay. And so that's where she's going to go next. So she's going to make time to go and speak to her and figure out what's going next. But what the group did for her was to just give her multiple stories. And she's like, wow, I've never thought of this. I've never thought of this. I think this is a broader story for her, that she's made up the story. And it is in a very hierarchical higher education context in a university, that once as an academic, you become head of department, your peers kind of put you in a different box and have stories about how you are changed by your rank.
Yeah.
And she's confronting this at the moment. And this is just step one. Luckily, we still have them for many, many months. So we'll see where the story takes her.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Other thoughts or questions on this? Okay, let's look at the next capability. And I would love to ask the group that was working with perspective shifting, how did you define perspective shifting? And any practices that you came up with? Who was in that group? Who was in that group? I'll just check in the breakout rooms. That was Chantal, Ilse.
Miriam was, Chantal was, Sarah Ann, I don't see on the screen.
She's probably fallen off because of electricity going off. So
she was our gal.
Oh, no.
Who was going to share.
She took the notes.
Okay, so we'll go from memory. Anything, Jen, Miriam, anyone else in the group, just chip in. How did you define it?
Miriam, do you want me to just?
Yes.
Okay. We immediately started with the misassumption that it was perspective taking, and then we recognized it was perspective shifting. And the conversation was knowing yourself, knowing what your perspective is, and then being capable of seeing another perspective and being able to shift to that share. And then we went into a whole thing of, even if you can shift to see from that angle, might you not want to shift to sit there? So we had this whole, because two of us are living in the United States right now, and we have very strong feelings on one side of Roe v. Wade, and we can see the other point of view. We're not shifting. Anyway, Ilse was also in that group, so maybe she'd like to say something.
Yeah. Ilse, anything you want to add, or Miriam, anything you want to add on that? I think it's an interesting point.
Well, the first thing that I noticed is how quickly I went in perspective taking rather than shifting, and how that, like, that's a whole conversation. But the other piece of it was the willingness. So I can see these different perspectives, and I'm willing to sit in those different chairs and all of that, or as many as I can. I have the capacity to. But just because I can, I don't want to. I am not going to. I have a very strong conviction. I mean, when it comes and Jan brought up the perfect thing, what's going on in the US. I have a conviction. If you want to have your perspective, and that's fine, keep it, but leave me alone. Leave my body alone. Don't tell me what to do. So is perspective shifting, whatever we make up, right? But is perspective shifting moving towards that, or just like in action of saying, okay, yeah, you created this, I'll go along with your program, then no.
Okay, great. So let's look at this. Ilse, something you want
Sarah
to add?
Sarah Ann made a good point in terms of that if you start on one perspective and then you open yourself up to more perspectives, you very rarely will end up on the same perspective. So if you start with A and then you get B and C and whatever coming in, you're going to end up somewhere else, not still stuck on A. Well,
I think on some issues, maybe we have very strongly held beliefs.
Yeah, no, definitely.
So the interesting thing, if we look at how Boston and Ellis define this, is they define perspective shifting not necessarily as involving belief shifting, but rather zooming out so that I can see the different perspectives on a situation and the agendas of various stakeholders. So this is very strongly written from leadership language, so just note this. And what they're offering there is it's not necessarily about shifting your first person perspective. Ooh, whoever's taking a call, please just mute yourself. But rather to say, what more can I see when I step back from my first person perspective? So it's about inhabiting almost a different perspective to just my own. And they say that, so what they reference here is Cook-Reuter, Terrio-Fallon, and then the stuff I've added in brackets, where immediately as I was reading this, there's so much about meta perspective, Cantor's bystander move, the work of Byron Katie as well around inverting subject and objects that might be useful here that they don't reference. Okay. So there are 4 stages of this. The first is called acknowledging. So in acknowledging, it's like, oh, okay, this is my perspective. This is how I feel about it. This is even how strongly I feel about it. And just noticing that. Then they go to cooperating, inquiring, and co-creating as being the next levels of this. So in cooperating, that part of what I need to do is I need to see other people in terms of more than just stereotypes. So seeing other people, so I'm saying goodbye to putting people in simple boxes. So at this point, let me hold on to my very strong belief and let me not stereotype, for example, pro-lifers in Roe versus Wade as an example. Just know that there might be a complex set of things at play there as there is for me. Then in hello, clearly then I'm recognizing that people are complex and have multiple reasons for doing what they do. So I'm not necessarily shifting my beliefs. I'm just allowing other people to be complex too, because I know that I can have a complex reason why I've ended up where I am, and I'm allowing other people to have complex ways for ending up and multiple reasons for ending up there too. Then the next is the inquiry space. And in the goodbye category, there they say, what I want to stop doing is calling my perspective objective and filtering it through. So I'm saying it's objective and it's actually being filtered through my beliefs and biases. So what I'm wanting to do is to notice how and why my beliefs and biases affect my attempts to see the world through other eyes. So a lot of the perspective shifting here is like trying to see through other eyes, trying to see through other eyes. It doesn't mean I need to accept the beliefs from there, but I'm trying to see through other eyes. And I think a lot of unconscious bias work that we do, for example, in diversity and inclusion field, also helps a lot with doing this kind of level 3 work. And then co-creating is when I have, and here they call it objectivity, which is very interesting, having my objectivity hijacked by my baggage and my hot buttons. And then the hello is finding creative ways to step back from my own and others' viewing points to see how our subjective realities affect each other. One of the most interesting socio-political experiments that I have come across in recent years, and it does relate to the US here, is a sociologist with deeply held liberal values who ran into the problem that no matter what she did, she kept kind of simplifying, judging, stereotyping people on the opposite side of the spectrum. And her self-induced experiment was moving deep into red country, into a very small town, and going to live there for 6 months of the year and getting to know people outside of the political conversation, and really coming back. And her beliefs have not shifted, and her ability to be in conversation with other points of view has become a lot more subtle, a lot more inviting, and a lot more possible in terms of the kinds of conversations that she's enabling. So maybe that's useful to also think of the perspective shifting piece. So what practical work do they do around perspective shifting in this book? So they have multiple reflection sheets that help you work on tricky relationships. So first, identify a tricky relationship. Why is it tricky at the moment? And then one of the pieces they do so first, that's the reflection piece. The inquiry piece is then to call up as a thought experiment. They work in this piece a lot with thought experiments. So first, it's not about doing something out there in the world, but just imagining, as in philosophy, there's lots of thought experiments that you can do. So this one would be, imagine you are in conversation with a really trusted advisor, a really wise person, and you're asking their advice on what to do in this relationship. So you're evoking your own wisdom through the archetype of someone you value to think with you on this relationship. And then the experiment part is to, after having done a lot of reflective work, to go and have an actual, whatever you want to call it, crucial conversation with the person that you have this tricky relationship with. The next thing that they suggest is kind of empty chair or third perspective exercises for those of you that have some relationship systems coaching training or some therapeutic or gestalt training. That idea of there's an empty chair, you're having the conversation with the person that you have the tricky relationship with, they're not in the room, there's an empty chair representing them. And then you can even go and sit in the empty chair and speak back at you. And so you can shift perspective in that way. The third perspective is the perspective of the relationship that we work with quite a lot in the relationship systems work, where I'm in my perspective, then I walk to your perspective and back to my perspective. Now I'm going between this empty chair, but there's the third perspective of the relationship. And so I walk out of my perspective and your perspective into the perspective of the relationship, looking back at how the two of us are talking, relating. And then I give my observations, yeah, from the perspective that's beyond me or you. And then I step back into me and I notice how my perspective may have shifted here. Then an interesting one is they say, if you want to up the heat, we know that heat experience is very good for vertical development. Don't just talk to an empty chair, but invite a witness to come and watch you talk at the empty chair. Now, the coach might be that witness, but someone whose opinion really matters to you. Now you may be talking to that empty chair in a different way. Yeah? Then I've added in here Byron Katie's turnaround work because they haven't put it in. And for me, that's so powerful in terms of perspective shifting. If you don't know the work, just Google the work, Byron Katie. Her real name is Katie Byron, but she's turned it around. And she's got also some practical ways in which you can work with projection and take projections back. Yeah, so there's some interesting thoughts here on perspective shifting. So questions, comments, observations, thoughts on perspective shifting, especially for those that were so, you know, I'm not going to change my perspective. Can you see how the skill works? It doesn't force you to change your belief. It just asks you, what are the agendas at play? How can I be more understanding of that? Yeah, great. Jane, Rikus.
So I'm wondering about, and even as I say this, I realize it's in your type 5 popping out there, two thoughts on resources and complexity. Because it seems to me in practical terms, the sort of perspectives that really bedevil the world these days are unbelievably complex. It's large questions, some of it extremely technical aspects to that. So for me to really step into a different perspective is enormously expensive. I mean, unless you can do it sort of a token exercise, do the mind experiment, but it's a caricature of frequently of what the other perspective really entails. So, I mean, you can go live for 6 months of the year in an entirely different community, but that takes resources. It's another life, essentially. So, you know, I think island holidays are a really good idea, but they're too expensive. And the same perhaps with really managing to step into other perspectives. Yeah,
I think, Rikus, this is where these capabilities do interrelate, and why they also say that sense making is the hardest capability to develop, because that idea of the complex, multiple interrelated factors that are impacting on what's happening here or what this perspective is it's not just expensive, it's really hard to unravel, and there's lots of non-linearity and things that are impacting this. So first, if we go from the distinct categories into what are we talking about here, we're talking about complexity, and sense making is part of what's such a massive investment if we really want to unravel all the strings. So I agree with you. I guess if we pull back to the focus for perspective shifting in this book, they break it down at a very practical level to the relationship between my perspective and your perspective as a colleague or someone in my life that I'm having trouble with. Yeah. So they, and even then, I know it's really hard to understand where you come from and all of those things. So we've scaled it up into some systemic challenges in the book. They're working at a much simpler level around just one-on-one relationships. So if we pull this back into Enneagram instincts, maybe self-relating is an SP kind of one, and this is more an SX one-to-one kind of space that they're playing with in terms of the capability that they're developing. Yeah. And wouldn't it be lovely if all of us could live the lives where we could go and live in another town for 6 months to understand people that trigger me often? Yeah. I would want to join that version of reality too. Yeah.
Good.
Right.
Thanks.
Other questions and comments? And Chantal, in particular here, I know that there's some Gestalt practices that are being used here. So anything from I'm popping your name in, you can also refuse. I'm not voluntolding, but anything from a Gestalt perspective that rings a bell here that you find interesting?
Yeah, the empty chair. I mean, you talked about it already. The technique of physically moving into another perspective and talking from that place. I think that's very powerful. And in the group I was in, we talked a little bit about understanding another perspective in kind of a cognitive way, but really feeling it, which is empathy. You know, if you look at the behaviors that relate to empathy in the EI research, it's about really being able to feel into where another person is. And that's why I popped that reference into the chat.
Yeah.
There's some research there from Richard Boyatzis around what happens in the brain when we can anticipate how other people are feeling and thinking. And what's interesting about that research is that he's looked at, so that part of the brain is the default mode network that can do empathy and all this like big picture thinking. The other one is the task positive network. And he looks at how people like IT engineers, auditors, accountants, financial advisors spend all of their time in the task positive network, and moving into this place of empathy and seeing how others can think and feel is really difficult for them. So he talks about good leadership being able to shift brain networks. And I think that's what we're talking about here. And definitely in Gestalt, there's a whole Gestalt practice in leadership around being able to be in strategic relationships, which are logical, deductive, hierarchical, you know, performance management kind of things, and then being able to very easily shift into intimate relationships that are about care and compassion and peer. Even if there's a reporting line, it's about feeling into the kind of human condition of other people. So those are some thoughts that came up for me. And the big thing in Gestalt that we talk about multiple realities, and every reality is valid. It's about what you said, that conversation between a person and the environment, what we call in Gestalt, the organism environment interdependence. So it's about that conversation, and everybody's having that conversation in a different way, in a different whatever. And every single one of those is valid, even if they are completely acceptable to us sometimes, if you think Roe v. Wade. So it's just validating that is a reality.
Yeah, thanks, Chantal. That's really helpful. And I guess a lot of the book is really aimed at and written for people who mostly spend their time in this task positive neural network. And it's in training the brain to be able to shift and to shift more often and to strengthen the more empathy-driven part of the network. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. Anyone else with anything to add here? So let's then go on to the third one. And who was the group that spoke about opposable thinking? And how did you define it?
Well, that was the small group.
You became a binary.
Right. Nonetheless, we had, I think, a very fruitful discussion. Rikas, did you want to speak to this, or should I?
Go for it, please. Thanks.
Sure. So we talked about how my mind first went to a book that I came across a couple of years ago in a course in my organizational dynamics program at the University of Pennsylvania called the Opposable. Sorry, I apologize. Let me get rid of that. The book is called The Opposable Mind by Roger Morton. And the thesis of that book, very briefly, is that successful leaders have been able to combine or synthesize opposites.
Yeah.
Resulting in what Morton calls both and thinking, as opposed to either or. In other words, you don't have to choose between the two opposites. You can look for a way to combine the opposites. And Rickus very perceptively pointed out that, yes, this encourages creativity in looking for ways to accommodate both polarities, both sides of a polarity.
Yeah.
And
Right.
seeking out, and part of this involves seeking out opposable views, opposing views, and fully exploring those opposing views, and that process can encourage creativity.
Yeah.
And also considering many different scenarios and exploring those many different scenarios.
Beautiful. Thanks. Thanks so much, Paula. So Boston and Ellis, opposable thinking, responding to the dilemmas of conflicting ideas that can create tensions within us or between us and other people, and working with opposing views. And here they say, what polarities, conflicts, and views are at play? How do I respond to that? They specifically reference the work of Lasker and Morton. I added Barry Johnson and his polarity mapping in there because he's made it very practical. And the 4 different levels there. So the first is upholding either or thinking. And we need to move to level 2, which is negotiating between different ideas. So here in negotiating, we say goodbye to believing that there's a correct answer, kind of either or kind of thinking. And the hello is starting to see shades of gray and believing that the best answer can vary depending on context. So that's kind of the inner process. And you can see this is a thinking based, it's called opposable thinking. There's lots of thinking going in here. In the mediating part is treating polarities when it is actually a polarity, a both and thinking. Goodbye to treating it as either or debates that need to be won and lost, and saying hello to finding polarities everywhere, including in my own thinking, noticing their cause and divisive effects, finding creative ways beyond mere compromise. And then at the integrating level, saying goodbye to feeling discouraged by the absence of objective truth. And this is an interesting one because I think for me personally, as I've embraced polarity thinking, sometimes there is this like, oh, there's just no answers anymore. Yeah, where has the truth gone? And it's getting to that space inside me where I don't feel discouraged by that, and accepting that some dilemmas are simply unresolvable. And then hello to integrating the poles, finding those creative solutions where the both and comes together into a mutually attractive way, and challenging my own internal polarities in the moment. And one of the ones that I work with and I find comes up quite a lot in working with leaders is the one idea that if I'm going to care about people, I will be less task effective. Yeah. Or if I become kind, then I'm going to lose efficiencies. It's this very interesting thing that I in some way, I have to keep being very hard-nosed as a leader and pushing people and sweating my human assets. Because if you just open the door a little bit to care, then, everything will fall apart and we lose efficiencies and we won't make our targets anymore. And so this whole idea of finding the place of what does it look like to be caring and people-oriented and task-oriented, holding people and task next to each other and weaving them together rather than feeling I need to make a choice is a between the two and stand in one side is a very helpful process to go through. So some of the things that they help you with the exercises in the book is to identify and question my own beliefs and assumptions, especially where I have these strongly held beliefs. And so here, once again, we can go to Jennifer's work on when I really believe that I'm right. And I can use some of her work here. Then they have a process that they've made quite linear that takes you through the steps that Barry Johnson's polarity mapping does, which is what's the benefit of the one side, what's the downside of the other side, what's the benefit of the opposing view and the downside of that, what happens, if I go into the downside of both, what happens if I, what possibility emerges if I can harness the upside of both, and then to solution from there, and to figure out what my early warnings is. So if you're not familiar with Barry Johnson's polarity mapping, go look that up. I love the process, and it's a bit more accessible than the linear way that they've put it in Upgrade into a step-by-step. What they do in the book, though, is they say that when you start mapping polarities, be careful of doing this alone. Why don't you bring others with opposing views into the process so that you can really enliven the other parts of the perspectives that may be harder for you to access? What's the upside of this opposing side of the polarity? So involve them in the process so you can enliven it more. So you've done some thinking, now go out and speak to people who hold that belief. And then they say, as you get more used to this idea of treating either or as both ands, as a leader, your job is to go and present polarities to others at work as polarities, as these things that cannot be resolved, and tell the story of how we need to find a way of weaving the two together, and ask for feedback on your ability to speak into this more complex polarity space. They then also say that coaching constellations can be very helpful. Now, I don't know who's familiar with family constellations. That's a particular way in which a whole group of people are involved there. But they say using objects in coaching to represent different views and how we relate to each other and moving them around, building that kind of physical constellation can be really useful. And then they say what's also helpful for leaders is to bring groups together that need to weave a polarity like task and people together, and facilitate the process of getting the group to find solutions, not you finding the solutions, that harnesses both sides of a polarity. So if you practice facilitating, first presenting and then later getting groups to facilitate polarity weaving, and that's the language they use, which I quite like. The idea of weaving polarities together is really, really helpful. So I'll stop the share here and ask. Opposable thinking, for me, there's a lot of polarity. For me, it's polarities. I would use polarities as the word rather than, but that's my inner linguistic, frame. Any thoughts, any ideas, anything you've seen working or not working in the space? Yeah, we've had some people experiencing constellations that I know are in the group. If you want to share what that's like. What I like is the practicality there. Go and present polarities to others. Go and facilitate a group to weave them together. That's quite practical rather than just sitting in the coaching with ABCD. Yeah, so thoughts, inputs, questions? Jen.
My colleague in the K through 12 education sphere, Jane Kesey, has polarity management, and she has people literally physically stand and does the whole thing on the floor, and what is the upside and what's the downside, and it is incredibly, people get it intellectually, and then they get very challenged by it. And in education, how much clarity do you give a student? How much flexibility do you give a student? How much autonomy do you give a student? How much do you need to have them align? And it's really beautiful and very focused on the challenges that are most present for educators. But it's a leap for them to think, because and I call it tipping a seesaw. Don't tip people's seesaw. There will only be one side, and leaders do that often. We're going to do this, and they don't see the polarity. And so that's how I call it. Don't tip the seesaw, because then nobody's on the other side to deal with it.
Yeah. Thanks, Jen. That's a beautiful example. And I think just to take that further, when we work in the field of change management, in our organizations and organizational transformation, this is often part of what happens as well, because what we do is we tell the story in such a compelling way about why the change is great, that we actually do a disservice to what's great about what currently exists. And then that gets people's backs up and gets us in a particular space. So learning how to weave both sides, really useful. Nick, earlier you wanted to say something, and then I see Pete and Micah. So Nick, are you sorted? Okay, Pete, over to you.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add to the both and solution is the option of the neither nor, which is sometimes overlooked when looking for that third way.
Yes. And any particular ways in which you work with that with clients, Pete, that could be helpful here?
Nothing specific comes to mind. It's sort of what comes up in the moment for me when working with that moment.
Yeah.
The only thing, there is a diagram which I only note as neti, which, but I can't describe it without drawing it, and I don't want to take the time of drawing it.
Okay. But that's really useful. Sometimes we just need to step away from the whole offering and say neither nor. Love that. Micah, anything you want to add?
Yeah, it's a question that I want to ask. I've been having a bit of fun on the side panel on Roe versus Wade, but behind it actually sits a question. As much as you could facilitate various processes to facilitate multiple perspectives, to facilitate opposable thinking and possibly integration, it's a lot easier to do when you are discussing a topic that do not fundamentally clash with people's very deep-held value systems and worldviews.
Yes.
And the moment you start stepping and start slaughtering those holy cows, it becomes an extremely emotive discussion. And in that, a fundamental part of that conflict resolution, and that is the work with opposable thinking. But how do you do that? How do you dial down that very strong emotional dial to the point where we can actually have this conversation? And it's not just Roe versus Wade. I've seen a very shrill response to vaccines, and those who decided not to take it, and others who wanted to take it. And while we may want to look at this as individual choices, there's a direct societal impact. And it again goes back to deeply held issues. And in the case of vaccines in South Africa, I've got a theory, and I think it's got a lot to do not with the vaccine, but with whether or not we trust our government. And the average South African has some trust issues, and they are not entirely ungrounded there. But and again, this whole thing around Ukraine. So we are entering a period in our I think, you know, it's in economic terms we would say the animal spirits are rising, but it's becoming a very, very heated, deeply polarized, deeply you know, there's a lot of noise to a lot of these discussions that make reasonable discussion to a very large extent almost impossible.
Yeah.
So what to do with that? Because I'm not only seeing it on big issues, I'm seeing it within organizations where things that shouldn't have that big an emotional impact on people, because it doesn't go to value systems, are seen as that, are experienced as such. And you see almost the same kind of reaction around very mundane things.
So I guess this is where these things are really complex and interrelated, Micah. And I'm sure if we had a silver bullet, we would have used it on some of these things already. So just a couple of thoughts from my side. I think that's where, if we see the overall task of adult development, and we keep that in mind, our contribution to adult development and helping individuals upgrade continues to help us have these conversations better. So whether we in the moment can shift people or not, I do think that as we all upgrade, we're able to be in the conversations in a less triggered way. So the self-relating piece is really important. If I can self-regulate when I'm in a topic that is very heated, then it's very different to me in an unregulated state. So that's part of it. What I've seen from a relationship systems coaching perspective is really helpful, is sometimes to get the words out of the way and to work with bodies and with our somatic experience more than that. So that's where, instead of saying, where do we all stand on this issue, to go, those that feel that, go to that side of the room, or stand to the center of the room. Those that feel in the other way, stand to the corners of the room. You know, what questions do you have for each other? So it would be to facilitate the conversation in a different way to the way we normally have it, as one option. And the third option you've given already, which is sometimes the polarization in ideas. If we get on the balcony and we look down on it and we remove the issue and ask, what is this actually about? Is this about freedom? Is this about trust in our governing institutions? Is this, because if we're having a conversation around trust in governing institutions, that conversation can be very different to the one around, should I vaccinate or not vaccinate, as an example there. So I think if we can change the question we're asking in a way that allows us to talk differently, then maybe there is something else that can shift. And you're right, we are in a space where we are increasingly polarized, and we're being polarized through also the manipulation of echo chambers that relate to the way in which social media works and a whole lot of things. So it's very complex right now. Meg Wheatley always says, even when I'm faced with the biggest, excuse my French, shitstorm, my job is to figure out how I can be an island of sanity in the conversation. And so beyond all of the things that are going on and the many polarizations we might face, the question I can ask myself in that is, what does it take for me to be an island of sanity? And that's not a positional perspective. That is an emotional and somatic perspective. In some way. Yeah. Great. So we have a little bit of time left. So I want us to also look at Sensemaking. And you'll see here. So let's first hear, I'm one step ahead. Who was the Sensemaking group and how did you define it? Let's go there.
Yeah, we had a really interesting chat. And we kind of came up with a lot of different lenses on this, starting with one interpretation that we might have of sense making as, hey, what is my unique processing system? You know, what is my unique sense-making operating system that I have that's unique to me. And then a different way, and maybe a more conventional way that we might have interpreted it, would be, how am I drawing meaning and connecting my different experiences to create some coherent sense of meaning from them? And you might see this if an event happens at work and you ask someone, oh, what happened? You know, they'll give you some interpretation of that event. And we had a few really great phrases which I took notes of. For example, we're living in an interpretive world. So one person will give you a different take to someone else. And maybe if you ask the same person in week 1 and week 2, they'll give you a different telling. You know, that's the extent to which it's interpreted. We had another great phrase, which was, when we were delving into sense making and working with sense making with clients, you know, we're now getting into maybe noticing the noticing, which speaks to how are we bringing awareness to your default or underpinning, with some of the words used, default or underpinning ways to make sense of this, of kind of where you go to immediately, to then work with that. And how an individual client, you know, if you asked, if you kind of were able to ask them why you're interested in understanding your sense making, you might just get a range of answers. Not that would be a typical question you might probe at. But in a group, we also came up with, in that setting, maybe you're going to get different responses here. Maybe some people don't really want awareness coming into their sense making. Maybe there's something uncomfortable there and they're not kind of prepared to look at that. So really, really interesting discussion, and everyone who was there, jump in if I've left anything out that needed to be in there.
Yeah. What I love about that, Nick, is you've woven self-relating, opposable thinking, perspective shifting, so many of these things into how you were thinking of sense making, which is, I think they do all feed into that. So if we look at the sense making Boston and Ellis offers, they say the big question is, what on earth is going on here? What is going on here is what sense making is about. So this is about observing, understanding, and processing the complexity of a situation. Getting your head around the different interconnected topics, data points, issues, causal relationships. And I think in terms of the references there, you can say, see Elliot Jacques, who wrote about sense making with the hyphen quite a lot. And I'm not familiar with Catherine Kayson's work. I don't even know if I'm saying the surname correctly. But those were the two references they brought. I work a lot more with the sense making that's written without the hyphen by Dave Snowden from Cognitive Edge. And it is a way into understanding what's the nature of the system that I'm dealing with here. Is it simple? Is it complicated? Is it complex? And he changes his language for those domains quite often, or is it in chaos? But it's like, what is going on here? And in the book, they say this is hard to develop because in part, the things that I can see and the things that I know I can't see, and then the things I don't even know I don't see, are all part of what's going on here. And how do you really develop the capacity to know what the things are that you don't know? Very complex, using Johari's window language here. But what they say is at the first level, we're analyzing in response to what on earth is going on here. We're analyzing, we're using the data we're drawing pictures on it. They say the next level they call diagnosing, which is not just relying on tried and tested rules and processes, but focusing on that. And this is something that Dave Snowden speaks of a lot, that idea of doing little experiments, like forays of action, and seeing if it's moving us in the right direction or not. So experimentation and live action learning as a way of seeing and experiencing how things work, rather than just, following the formulas. The next level of sense making, they call connecting. And in connecting, we say, let go of this idea of single preset goals and find ways of spotting numerous interconnected ways forward and possible value outcomes. And here you can already see that things like scenario planning and developing scenario thinking can be very helpful. Because in scenario planning, we're saying there are multiple futures unfolding at this point in time. You know, let's plan for all of them and then see which strategies are going to work best across multiple scenarios. And then reframing is the fourth level, which is goodbye to uncertainty about how to handle a myriad of complex options, and hello to weaving disparate threads into single, coherent, co-created, and adaptable sets of strategies. So instead of getting lost in the complexity, in some way I'm able to pull them into meta narratives or meta strategies, or find a way of telling the story of how this complexity fits together. So they say at the very start, if we're struggling with sense making, start by doing things like Ishikawa or Fishbone Diagrams. And that you can find very easily in root cause analysis work. You learn how to do Fishbone Diagrams. Now, core to what they say here is it's not just about bringing more variables in. It's also about connecting the brain into ways of thinking about issues that are non-linear. And when you're starting with things like Fishbone Diagrams, then at least you're out of the input, process, output, you know, kind of linear thinking that our brains find a bit simpler to work with. Then once you've started doing things like Fishbone Diagrams, you may want to start doing things like mind maps, and in particular, because that's also, and you can not just mind map in the traditional way from the center, but also connecting points in the mind map, mind mapping with others, definitely doing scenario planning. And then they have particular strategies for doing stakeholder connections and influencing maps that's way beyond the kind of stuff you learn in Project Management 101, which is like, here are the 4 quadrants, put your stakeholders in it. They go through a process where they say, identify all your stakeholders. Now draw circles around them. How big a stakeholder are they? So small circles for small stakeholders, big ones for big ones. Now, what's the relationship between the stakeholders? If you had to turn the way in which they're relating to the issue into an archetype, so they're, you know, the devil's advocate, or they're the supporter, or they're the whatever, pop that in together. And then they have different ways of working on influence maps. And so very different, more complex ways of working with mapping stakeholders and their influence into your projects and your work. And then multiple cause diagrams. And I think, Rikus, this is maybe a little bit like how parts of your brain work, so we can all learn from you here. But that's that idea of you start with what's going on here, do your research, what else could be going on there, how does this relate to that? And it becomes a little bit maybe like a Sherlock Holmes map on the boards that they always have in the movies of all the ways in which these things connect. But really practicing, in some way visualizing the way in which things relate to each other. Now, I know in terms of my own development in this space, when I learned how to build complex adaptive simulations, non-linear simulations, that was a massive, massive upgrade for me, because I'm getting out of spreadsheets and I'm building circular causal relationships and trying to express that not just visually, but also in mathematics, and bringing more and more data points in. And at some point, that practice is actually, I think, irreplaceable in some way. That idea of, can I get out of the spreadsheet version of life and into, when issues are truly complex, as many things are, figuring out how to, in some way, represent that and work with it. Not necessarily believing that I can simulate everything, but at least getting that experience of having a different way of representing what on earth is going on here. So we have a couple of minutes left. Any thoughts on sense making? I know, like, machine learning, and there's interesting ways in which, you know, the intelligence that lives in our technology are also trying to make sense of things in ways that are maybe way beyond us as well. But any thoughts on sense making and how to develop that capability that you've seen work? Rikus?
Just one thought on that diagram you had that I found surprising. At the reframing, right at the top level, they say goodbye to uncertainty, which to me, when you say goodbye to uncertainty, it's almost certainly a red flag. There's something wrong then. So just that's strange to me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This book, as I said, this book is definitely not the answer to everything in vertical development terms. And there are some flaws in it as well. And yet, you know, we work with the contradictions, and I agree with you. When we're dealing with complexity and we become certain, we're in very dangerous territory. Maybe it's something goodbye to getting stuck in uncertainty, or getting stuck because of the uncertainty. So acting despite uncertainty is maybe part of what would be a healthier way to put it. Other comments or observations or practices that you'd like to... Oh, and Jen, I see your question around more complex work with stakeholders. I have not come across this particular way of working with stakeholders before, and they're not referencing someone else's work in relation to this. So this may be their piece of work. So if you look at the chapter in the book, if you're interested in that, go look at what they're doing there. They might well, there will definitely be other people out there doing it, but you know, I'm so over that 2x2 matrix for stakeholder analysis. You know, it's better than nothing, but I'm not sure it always adds that much value. Wonderful. Other comments or inputs?
Lucille.
Yes, Alistair.
Thanks to you, I discovered my new favorite leader in outer development.
Yes.
Bill Torbett.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And he talks about action logic, right?
Yeah.
And what I liked about that is the action piece. And what I'm getting from today's session, very useful. It's more meta stuff. It's more for the thinking side of things, right? So how do we put this into action? Because people will say, oh, I've shifted my perspective. But if you look at your action, there has been no change. So what's the point of shifting perspective if you're not going to change? So I'll give you an example. Like for me, I went to an all boys high school, right? And some of the themes we were taught there is like, you know, academically, you can never be beaten by a woman, right? Then you go to varsity and you start to realize there's women who get higher marks than you, right? So at that point, your perspective shifts, right? But if I don't recruit women in my business, if I don't partner with female coaches, etc., has my perspective really shifted? You know, it's just, then I can even write a nice article about gender empowerment, and yet my actions are not following that logic. So how do we, long and short of it, how do we turn this thinking stuff into action for our clients and ourselves even?
Yeah, so I guess that's the loop that they're constantly reinforcing here. So they say the loop is reflect, inquire, experiment. And then obviously track the results and integrate it afterwards. But the idea is first do some thinking, reflection on it, journal, find out these things, talk to your coach about it. Then the inquiry is go speak to other people and then decide what you're going to do. Actually go and experiment based on this new awareness and thinking and the feedback that you've gathered, and go and do stuff differently. But you don't have to do massive stuff at the start. Just do small things frequently and see where that takes you. And so if you're going to do, for example, work on, as we said there, polarity thinking, it's not just about thinking differently, it's going and presenting polarities to people and then facilitating polarity-based decision making in a group, and then maybe tracking that. So it's all in the action piece. And their ideas, like going to the gym, do it frequently in small bites. Dave Snowden also speaks about multiple small experiments. So the last thing I want to share in the last couple of minutes we have here is what they say about how to make the learning stick, and Alistair's taken us there. So the first thing there, that quote, it's easier to act your ways into new ways of thinking than to think yourself into new ways of behaving. Then they say small, frequent doses are far more effective than large one-off interventions. So don't wait to go and hire the female in Alistair's as the first thing that you try and do. You know, find different ways of being in the world differently with women. And then, you know, maybe at some point you are going to hire the female, and we're just using that as a metaphor. We're, you know, just to be clear on that. Then they say the true learning requires the observation. So that's journal, inquire, then go and experiment, then repeat the experimentation, reflect on how it's working, and integrate that into your existing ways of doing things. They also say if you're really moving from one level to the next in your actions, you will be more confused, frustrated, and anxious. So get used to it and brace yourself for that. Accept that anxiety. They say learning with others is more effective than learning alone. So, you know, convene in groups, try these experiments together, and especially learn with people that are in the same world as you, because if your world is moving with you, then it's easier. They say teaching others accelerates your own learning. And we learn best when applying what we're learning to actual current challenges, as opposed to just to theoretical problems. So that's part of their thinking. With that, we've come to the end of our session, and I'll just invite people to, maybe just one or two people, to unmute and say, what's one thing that you've taken from today? What's really sticking or exciting from the conversation? Let's just get 2 comments so that we don't stay over time. 1 sentence, what's really struck you about this today?
Acting yourself into new ways of thinking.
Thanks. Thanks, Andrea. Anyone else? Jen, I saw that you were also unmuted.
Well, Alistair can go. The resources and the connections in the chat that can extend my thinking. Thank you, everybody.
Brilliant. Thanks. Absolutely. So thank you so much. We look to see you 2 weeks from now. I am not 100% sure what the next topic is. It's because it's one of Julia's sessions, not mine. So please look out for the emails from us. And it was wonderful to see you all here. Thanks so much, everyone. Over and out.